Hello everyone, good morning. I hope you're doing well. I'm going to share my screen. This lecture is going to cover the progressive era in American history. We have covered thus far all the way up to the end of the Gilded Age and American imperialism and the Spanish-American War. Now we must cover the progressive era. This will cover everything from Presidents Theodore Roosevelt all the way to Woodrow Wilson and the beginning of Warren G. Harding. This is kind of important, right? And I'm going to explain why, of course. Um, uh, Theodore Roosevelt is the reason why we have national parks, and he broke up the trusts and the big businesses that were forcing crazy labor restrictions on citizens in the Gilded Age that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to jump right into it. Okay, so here we go. This is the progressive era, which goes from the 1890s until around 1920, and then we get into the era of the Roaring Twenties, which is Calvin Coolidge and the end of Herbert Hoover. So the origins of the progressive reform. So progressivism happens around, like I just said, the 1890s to the 1920s, but its main focus is in 1901 with the ascension of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson leaves office after the end of World War I. So who are the progressives? They're urban middle class, they're managers and professionals, and they're women. And why? They want to address the problems that are arising from industrialization, which is big business and labor strife, urbanization, which is the slums, the political machines, and corruption overall in the country, and immigration, which includes ethnic diversity, inequality and social injustice, women, and racism. Women still do not have the right to vote until the end of this reform era. Yeah, that's even with the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments of Reconstruction, which allowed for voting for all males, but not women. So what are their goals? Their goals are to create a government that is accountable to the people. So more of a solid democracy. They want the regulation of corporations and monopolies so that they don't feel strangled. And they want social justice. They want workers, poor minorities to have representation and to have justice for the things that they want. They also want environmental protection. So how are they going to do this? They're going to do it through the government, through laws, regulations, and programs. And then efficiency, through value experts, the use of scientific study to determine the best solution. But how much is this going to cost, and how much is it going to get done? So this is the origins of progressivism. The muckrakers basically are just like a bunch of authors that develop these theories of thought. Jacob Riis writes How the Other Half Lives in 1890. Ida Tarbell writes The History of the Standard Oil Company in 1902. And Lincoln Stevens writes The Shame of the Cities in 1904. And it is these primary authors that begin the change of ideals towards progressivism. So municipal and state reforms. So as we all kind of know or learned by now, a lot of reforms begin at the local level. And so here we go. So municipal reform and utilities, water, gas, electric, and trolleys. In Dayton, Ohio in 1913, we switched to a council manager plan, and I'll explain further on this in just a moment. The picture below depicts a shoe line, which is men with gifts from ward boss Tim Sullivan in February of 1910. So here's the municipal reform. So we have a strong mayor system, and then we have a city manager plan. A strong mayor system puts the mayor at the top with the city council and then city services over here. The problem with this is that there's not a lot of management, and there's not a lot of direct control. And sometimes you get mayors that are elected to these positions that are political, but they really don't understand the ins and outs of how to run a city. But in a strong mayor system, which this is like Tulsa, so Mayor G.T. Bynum is a part of the strong mayor system. He's in charge of the day-to-day operations of the city, but he does not really have experience in running a city. where a city manager plan, which was implemented in Dayton, Ohio in 1913, most of the people that become city managers have extensive education and knowledge on how to run the day-to-day operations of a city. Anyway, interesting. So state political reform. This is Robert M. Laffotte. I don't even know how to say this guy's name. And he's a Wisconsin governor from 1900 to 1906. And he believed in secret ballots, direct primaries, and the passage of the 17th Amendment, which involves initiatives, referendums, and recalls on governors and presidents and senators and stuff like that. So state political reform, voter participation in presidential elections since 1876 to 1920. So the presidential election of 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes had 81% turnout. The next one in 1880 with Garfield was 79%. In 1884 with where Cleveland won, it was 77%. In 88, where Harrison won, 79. Cleveland again in 1892, 74. McKinley's first term, 79. McKinley's second term, 73. And you see the steady decline. Theodore Roosevelt's second term, 65. Howard Taft, 65 again. And then we have Woodrow Wilson, 58. Woodrow Wilson again, 61. And then we have Harding with 49%. So this is huge. And the progressives during this era believe that they have to reform voter participation in presidential elections and overall just in general in order to get more participation and voter turnout. This is an issue that we face even today, right? Voter turnout is really, really low in America, which of course puts our democracy at a great risk. And so this is a question that we've been facing since literally the founding. Of how to continue to get voters to come out and support their candidates, and honestly just vote. In a democracy, if you don't vote, your voice isn't heard, and so this is a big issue. So professional social workers in the state is a big reform that they want done. Settlement houses, education, culture, and daycare. Child labor laws enable education and advancement for working class children, not just for the rich children. Workplace and labor reforms, 8-hour workdays, improved safety and health conditions in factories, workers' compensation laws, so like minimum wage laws, and if you get hurt at the job, workman's comp is what people call it now. Minimum wage, unionization. So a union, right, is where all the workers, they come together and they band as a team to fight against the boss for things that they want. That's like the biggest summary I could probably give you with unionization. And then child labor laws. So child laborers, this top picture right here is child laborers in Indiana Glass Works. Down here is in Newberry, South Carolina. Shrimp processors here. And then the Brieger Boys, which is in Pennsylvania, which is literally, guys, kids in coal mines. So this is a settlement house, just to kind of give you an idea. These are just places that like take care of people that need some extra care. And then you have temperance. So this is where we get into like prohibition. Yes, if you didn't know, America prohibited the use of alcohol for like a little while in there. If you're wondering, yes, people still drank it. So I think we kind of learned our lesson. You can't just outlaw things and expect people not to use it. But yeah, it was illegal. There's a lot of movies on this too that you can watch that kind of explain like, well, in other words, just how to get around it. So yeah, we have the Temperance Crusade, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Anti-Saloon League. And here's like, so here's statewide prohibition. So before 1900 was Kansas and North Dakota. In the 1880s, Maine, 1851, guys, that's when it got its statehood. 1900 to 1910, Oklahoma actually had it outlawed in its original state constitution in 1907. And then everywhere else is, yeah, so this is on the eve of the 18th Amendment, which prohibits the use of alcohol. in 1819. Socialism alternatives. So this is some of the alternatives to progressivism. So the Socialist Party was ran by Eugene V. Debs, who was an industrial worker of the world, or IWW, or the Wobblies. And he actually ran for president a couple of times. And then there's the National Reform Party, which includes Presidents Roosevelt, President Taft, and Wilson as progressive presidents. So Roosevelt becomes president because of the assassination of President William McKinley on September 6th of 1901. Theodore Roosevelt was just elected vice president with him in the previous year. Theodore Roosevelt becomes the accidental president, and he's a Republican from 1901 until 1909. So he only serves one term on his own that's elected by himself, but he serves out the remainder of President McKinley's 4-year term. So Roosevelt presents this square deal idea. At the 1902 Anthocratic coal miner strike, and he presents the square deal. And basically what he says is that we got to give it to you square, right? We got to give it to you honestly, and we got to make it fair. So he's also the trust buster. So he breaks up monopolies all throughout the country, and he just, like, for example, the Northern Securities Company in 1904, good trusts and bad trusts. The Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act in 1906. So he literally busts up these huge monopolies using executive power. This is huge, guys. So anyway, then there's people that argue today that we've got huge monopolies, especially when it comes to technology, and that sometimes maybe some of those monopolies should be broke up to allow for the freedom of the market. I don't really have an opinion on that necessarily, but just to say that, like, this discussion is still happening even today in American history. Consumer protection. So Upton Sinclair writes the book The Jungle, which is very, very huge during this progressive movement. And it leads to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. So, like, imagine you go to Walmart to buy a roast or chicken, whatever it may be, pork, I don't care. That meat has went through inspections before it's placed out on the market for you to buy. Before 1906, there had been nothing that regulates the sale of meat. So people would just sell horrible meat to people, which is, like, gross, right? And then this is the first act that, like, goes through and analyzes drugs, and not necessarily like drugs, like drugs, but like prescription drugs and medicine that's prescribed to people. So Roosevelt also believed in conservation. He used the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to literally preserve Yellowstone, Yosemite, and this is like the first time that we get national parks. U.S. Forest Service, and he creates the U.S. Forest Service in 1906. Gifford Pinchot is like the founder of some of this stuff with him. The White House Conference on Conservation was first hosted in 1908. And then John Muir hopes kind of like photographs and art and helps out in Yosemite. Conservation, national parks and forests. This is the map of national parks and national forests throughout the United States, and pretty cool. If you look right here, Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, all of these things. President William Howard Taft becomes president in 1909 and serves until 1913. So one term. He's a 4-year guy. This is his birthplace in Mount Auburn. So Taft's progressive accomplishments. He continues the trust busting, but it causes a split in the Republican Party with the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909 and the Pinchot-Bellinger controversy. Forests and oil reserves and the 16th Amendment. Theodore Roosevelt said of Taft that he had completely twisted around the policies I advocated and acted upon. So Taft breaks with Roosevelt, does what he thinks is best, and it ends in his downfall. Woodrow Wilson in the election of 1912 runs against Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. So Roosevelt gets angry and decides to run against Taft for the Republican nomination. Taft wins the nomination. Roosevelt decides to form his own third party called the Progressive Party. Roosevelt then loses, and along with Taft, to Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson runs as a Democrat. Theodore Roosevelt creates a Progressive Party, which he calls the Bull Moose Party, and creates this idea of new nationalism or new American pride. This has huge significance because first of all, it ushers in a new wave with Woodrow Wilson, and it changes the ideas of Republican politics for the future. So Wilson, this is the electoral vote. Wilson gets 435, Taft gets 8, and Roosevelt gets 88. This is huge. So Woodrow Wilson believes in this idea of new economic freedom. He passes the Underwood-Simmons Tariff, which protects American economics, the 16th Amendment in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. And then the Keaton-Owen Act of 1916. So here's the beginning of the Federal Reserve. This is stuff that we still use even today, guys. So it's kind of cool. These are the boundaries and the districts. So now we get into women's suffrage. Quick side note. We didn't cover World War I with Woodrow Wilson because we're going to do that next week. Woodrow Wilson served during reigned and served during World War I. We will cover that, and I'm really, really excited to get into that with you guys. But that was just his progressive achievements while in office. So women's suffrage, this happens also during this progressive era. Women professions, the new woman and the club woman. So this is some examples of the Women's Club in Madison. And this is a local club for nurses that was formed in New York City in 1894. Kind of cool. So women's suffrage is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. Carrie Chapman Catt is like the boss. And this is the headquarters in Ohio, in Cleveland. And anyway, so this is the map before 1920 when the amendment is passed. And yellow is there's no voting by women. This light blue means they can only vote in primaries. The green, women can only vote in presidential elections. And then, as you can see, Oklahoma, women had complete voting rights. Interesting. So as you can see, Western states, which are newer, had already taken this more progressive role towards voting rights, where Eastern states, who were older and more traditional and dignified and rooted in more historical themes, decided to keep with the traditional ways. So the women's suffrage, Alice Paul was a leader along with the National Women's Party. The 19th Amendment is passed, and the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, is something that gets promoted during this time, but it doesn't really revive into the 1960s and 70s, but it never actually passes. The ERA is still out there. We'll get into that in the future. Race relations. So this is the black population in 1920. Under 10% is up here. 10 to 29 is this yellow. 30 to 49 is this maroon. And then red is 50% and over. So the South is still the main population of African Americans in 1920. So Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Niagara Movement, and the Talented Tenth and the NAACP is all founded during this time. So opposing discrimination, Booker T. Washington believed that through hard work, we can destroy discrimination, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps was his motto. He created the Tuskegee Institute, which educated African Americans, and the vocational education was something else that he sponsored for African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois, he disagreed with Washington and wanted blacks to demand full equality to the government. So how did African Americans face discrimination in voting during this time? So the 15th Amendment, as we all know, as we've discussed in the past, allows for the voting of African Americans. But here's some of the restrictions too. Here's some of the restrictions that are created by southern states to stop them from voting. This is the poll tax, literary tests, the grandfather clauses. So how? Southern states evade the 15th Amendment by requiring money to vote, must pass a test in order to vote. And if your ancestors could vote prior to 1960, you are allowed to vote. In other words, you didn't have to take the test if your ancestors voted before 1866. We'll think about that for a moment. The Civil War had just ended. How did these discriminate against African Americans? Routinely, it allowed them not to vote, just to be simple. They couldn't pass the test. They couldn't read because education was not really provided to them yet. They couldn't afford the poll tax because most of them were indentured servants or they were tenant farmers on their former plantations. So the NAACP is founded, and this is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's founded in 1909 in Springfield, Illinois, and it's founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Florence Kelley, and other progressive reformers. The NAACP was formed party in response to the continuing horrific practices of lynching and the 1908 race riot in Springfield, the capital of Illinois and the resting place of former President Abraham Lincoln. Appalled at the violence that was committed against blacks, a group of white liberals that included Mary White Ovington and Oswald Garrison Villard, both the descendants of abolitionists William English Walling and Dr. Henry Moskowitz, issued a call for a meeting to discuss racial justice. Some 60 people, 7 of whom were African American, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Mary Church Terrell, signed the call, which was released to the centennial of Lincoln's birth. The NAACP's principal objective is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of minority group citizens of the United States to eliminate racial prejudice. The NAACP seeks to remove all barriers of racial discrimination through the democratic processes. This group helps pave the way for continued work towards civil rights for African Americans even today. And that's the end of this lecture. The NAACP becomes literally what we use a lot, what we're going to talk about a lot when we get to the 1960s, but it's founded during the progressive era. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Sorry. So this is a pretty important lecture, guys, and I hope that you found it interesting. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but as we move forward, we will revisit these progressive era policies when we get into the civil rights movement and the counterculture revolution or the hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s. So next week we will move into, or next time we're going to move into World War I, which is exciting. I like World War I. And then after that, we will cover more important topics throughout American history. So see you next time. Hope you enjoyed this.